Welcome back to How to Fix Democracy, the show about the strengths and weaknesses of democracy around the world. We spent a lot of time in the show in a very serious, critical way, looking at the flaws, the problems, the challenges, perhaps even the crisis of American democracy in the age of Donald Trump, in the age of QAnon and many other areas which seem to be undermining American democracy. To celebrate July 4th, American Independence Day, you'll be watching this around July 4th, we thought it might be fun to have one of America's most original observers on the show to talk about her sense of democracy in America and citizenship in America. Roya Hakakian is an Iranian immigrant. She's an academic, very distinguished writer, and the author of a wonderfully entertaining and incisive book called A Beginner's Guide to America. Roya, welcome to How to Fix Democracy.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be with you again.
Roya, your book is an introduction for the uninitiated. It treats America in a way as if it's an empty canvas, rather like the supposed empty canvas. Of course, it wasn't quite as empty as they'd liked when the settlers first came in the 16th and 17th centuries. How would you tell a neophyte to America about July 4th? How would you explain it? What kind of day is it? What's it supposed to celebrate?
Well, I would say that it's the day that something grand happened, not just in this country, but in the world. That the founding fathers or the initial cast of leadership decided to create the blueprint of a system that had never existed before. And at the helm of that group was George Washington, who is the first leader who was ever in power, who willingly stepped down. That had never happened. It is, considering that I come from Iran, where we either have had a monarchy, or when we went from a monarchy to a republic, it's been a place where somebody else, the supreme leader, has a hold on the elections and who gets appointed, and the supreme leader is immovable and is simply there forever. It is an astounding thing to think that there was actually a president who himself decided that 2 terms were enough, and he or that presidencies should be limited 2 terms, and he stepped down. So I would describe 4th of July as a day not simply significant for America, but for the world community, as a moment where something other than monarchy, something other than a forever rulership came into being.
What's so bad about monarchy, Roya?
Well, maybe, if it were like England, if we had some monarchs who just were significant as far as, magazine covers were concerned, it would be fine. But if monarch turns out to be the person who controls everything, who decides, how many newspapers can run and, who can say what, and keeps appointing his own cronies to various positions, then that becomes a problem in a world that's moving fast towards wanting more to be more egalitarian in every way.
What would you tell Roya, the beginner to America, about the darker side of American history, particularly the America that is celebrated on July 4th is not really the America of slavery or of the elimination of the indigenous peoples? How does this fit into the narrative?
It is a painful history, and I'm always astounded by the fact that it is true in certain ways, certain residual effects of that dark history, no matter how many years pass, remain with us in some very insidious ways. But the way I see it is that, we, first of all, no history, no country in the world can claim to have been without sins. And secondly, that no original invention, call it the electricity or the telephone or whatever else that we have invented throughout history, never came out perfectly the first time around. That we create something, the germ of something, the beginnings of something, and then we begin to perfect it. So I think what was beautiful about what came into being in 1776, on July 4th, 1776, was the idea that all men should be equal. And then we realized, over the span of, decades, that all men needs to be stretched and needs to include other people who were not just white men. I think reconciling with the idea that that nothing originally comes out perfectly, and it is for us to advance it towards that perfection, is something to strive for our generation and for the rest of us now.
Roya, as a young Jewish woman growing up in Iran, pre-revolutionary Iran, what did you learn about the American Revolution? What did you learn about July 4th?
We didn't learn. I mean, I was in middle school and high school after the Iranian Revolution of 1979. So the only thing that we were exposed to primarily were the darker sides that you just referred to. We heard only that these pilgrims came to America and they decimated the natives who were here, which they did. And and then there was slavery and inequality in America. It's really interesting. The first place that I wanted to see, and the first place that every Iranian intellectual that I know wanted to see as soon as they landed in New York City, was not Radio City Music Hall. It was not the Statue of Liberty. It was not, any of the famous sites that we know. Do you know what it was?
Statue of Liberty, I assume.
No, it was always Harlem, because the Harlem that we heard was the most glaring symbol of inequality in America, and so many poetry by Langston Hughes and James Baldwin, the works of James Baldwin had all been translated more than any other American author. So post Iranian revolutionary period just told that narrative that America came into being on very harsh, violent terms, and it continues that tradition all the way to today, and it therefore is not to be trusted and can never be corrected.
Roya, we're talking a few days before July 4th. What are you going to do? Or what do you normally do? Do you celebrate it, or is it a day that you ignore?
It's not a day I ignore. For me as an immigrant, my life has certainly transformed for the better as a result of coming to America. And I think many immigrants like myself who have fled authoritarian systems see that fact. Many of us see through a lot of the weaknesses and flaws within the system and within the society, but we still acknowledge that the good that's already been built is worth celebrating and is worth hanging on to and making better and developing. So it is a day of celebration for me. And I think for, probably for many immigrants who are new and continue to see certain qualities in America that, as you and I have talked about before, that the native born cannot see because they have always lived with it.
Roya, you're a poet and a writer and a scholar of the world. You've traveled a lot. You grew up in Iran. You've written about many parts of the world. I think you almost settled in Europe at one point before coming here. Mm-hmm. Is there an equivalent to July 4th somewhere else? Is it Bastille Day in France? Might there be other traditions in Europe?
Yeah, and in Barcelona, in Spain today, they're celebrating their equivalent of Independence Day. I've been in the air flying over, Canada when they were celebrating their Independence Day. But I think the history here makes it complex and richer in a way that many others simply don't have that. I think the fact that American independence then opened the door to so many persecuted people who came to this country, who were invited to come to this country and take refuge here, makes this history, in a way, everyone's history. Makes this Independence Day, to a little bit of a degree, everyone's Independence Day, because not because we all became American or need to be American, but it created a dream that every one of us could claim a piece of it wherever we were. And I think that's what's making July 4th slightly different than other Independence Days anywhere else in the world.
The openness to immigration, the inclusiveness then of its political culture. We're of course speaking a few months, Roya, after the defeat of Donald Trump. He was openly hostile to immigration. Joe Biden seems to be ambivalent. He sent his vice president, Kamala Harris, to Central America to rethink American policy towards immigration. Do you think it's one of the stains on American contemporary democracy is that it seems so resistant, so unwilling now to take in immigrants?
Well, I think that the main problem, in my view, is that we're defining something as an immigration problem that is not an immigration problem. The fact that people are flooding out of Colombia and Guatemala and Honduras it becomes the immigrants who show up at our doorstep are not the cause, they're the effect of a more fundamental problem. We simply define it as an immigration issue because that's what we feel. But the main cause is there in those countries. And what we're doing wrong is that we're trying to fix it at the border, whereas we need to come up with some continental plan to address the issues that is driving the people out of the places that they surely don't want to leave. You know, I always say to people that America can be a paradise, and in some ways it is. But nobody who's born and raised in a place that may be a lot less than our, our beautiful country here, wants to, take off and go to somewhere else where they don't speak the language, where they have no relatives. And at some point, I've always said, where they have none of their ancestors buried in the ground. It's unnatural to leave that environment. But the point that we need to understand is that we're defining the consequence of a much larger and more serious issue as the actual cause. We need to go into those countries, I don't know, create a Marshall Plan for Latin America, but create something really large in order and establish a cooperation with the countries in Latin America in order to address the problem and make sure that people can go on living where they surely wish to continue living, as opposed to take off and come to our doorstep.
Roya, you're not the first person to write, quote unquote, a beginner's guide to America. The most famous beginner's guide was written by a French aristocrat a couple of 100 years ago, Alexis de Tocqueville. Mm-hmm. And Tocqueville suggested that the core identity of America and American democracy and American Democrats was a disdain, a rejection of natural authority, of aristocracy. Mm-hmm. Do you think that that's changed over the last 200 years? In your beginner's guide to America, are Americans today as suspicious and hostile to any kind of aristocracy as they were in the 19th century?
I think we are even more so. I think everything we're doing in order to assure racial equality, in order to achieve gender equality in workplace and elsewhere, is a move to reject what you're referring to as, aristocracy. So yes, we maintain that disdain from the beginning. However, I do hope that certain bastions of aristocracy do continue to remain within our society. And by that, I'm referring to our educational institutions. I think it's great that universities have tenured professors and associate professors and untenured professors, and students who need to defer to their professors who know a lot more and have far more experience and have worked hard to be where they are. In other words, I don't think every semblance of aristocracy is something that we need to get rid of, because we're not living in a society that wants to banish every sort of inequality. Certain inequalities create a desire and ambition in us to want to reach that higher level. And to me, scholarship is all about that. And in fact, I like it when I see it in university settings.
We had one person on the show, Daniel Markovits. I think you know him. He's a Yale University law professor and one of America's great critics of what he calls its meritocracy, yes, which is the new aristocracy. Mm-hmm. Are you at all concerned that this liberal aristocracy in California, on the East Coast, in New York and Boston and Washington, D.C., mm-hmm, is that their rejection, their contempt, their patronizing attitude towards Donald Trump and the new populism, that it's a return to the aristocratic values of pre-revolutionary America?
I don't think it's that. I think, however, that we are, that Daniel, in fact, is correct, that we are replacing one form of aristocracy with a different sort of aristocracy, but aristocracy nonetheless. And I think in certain ways, unless we recognize that, we need to re-educate certain class of people in America in order for them to be able to strive for better jobs or qualify for better jobs, is a key aspect, not just of equality, class equality, or or reducing the rift between the two classes, but it's also significantly important when it comes to the health of the American democracy, because the larger there is this income gap, which has multiplied in the last few decades, the less healthy is American democracy. So it isn't just a matter of injustice. It's also a matter of creating, a class that, as you're mentioning, becomes all too powerful and far more capable of controlling politics and deciding about the future of government, and that becomes unhealthy for our democracy. So I think reducing the income gap is not just a matter of social justice. It's also more fundamentally a matter of keeping democracy healthy.
Roya, our third series of How to Fix Democracy is focused on citizenship, on its importance, on its relationship with democracy.
Mhm.
When Tocqueville wrote his Beginner's Guide to America a couple of hundred years ago, he noted that the strength of American democracy was rooted in its intermediary institutions, its churches and labor unions and other intermediary groups existing between the state and the individual. He was a critic both, I think, of radical individualism and of strong state power, and he saw in America a solution to that. There are some people who have argued recently, Michael Lind, for example, he hasn't been on the show, but I've interviewed him for other series, suggests that the crisis of American democracy is a crisis of American citizenship. Those intermediary institutions, particularly labor unions, no longer exist. They've been done away with. And this contains the seeds for what Hannah Arendt warned were the origins of totalitarianism. Do you think in the early 21st century, in your Beginner's Guide to America, that we need to strengthen these intermediary institutions if we're to strengthen American democracy and citizenship?
You know, one of the questions that I kept asking myself, what it was that I always liked and felt great sympathy for, and even more than that, was incredibly moved by and inspired by watching, the civil rights movement in America, watching the marches of Martin Luther King, listening to that rhetoric, and going into the churches where these speeches were being given, was that it created a nationwide culture with certain fundamental principles and values that were inviolable. And it not only was beautiful in many ways, because so much of it was about changing the status quo, but so much of it was also about a greater ideal for America and for everyone who lived here. It was about love. It was about doing away with inequality, because hatred was a bad thing to live with, was a damaging thing to live with, and it was better to move on to loving. And I think those were the fundamental teachings of the church. And I am not a Christian, but I find that incredibly moving and beautiful. And I think it had so much power. I think it had created such a machinery that could do anything with the system that it had at its disposal. And the parallel thing existed in Iran too, but the way it worked was exactly to do the opposite of what the Martin Luther King and the Christian churches in America had done during the civil rights movement. They moved America to get closer, to become a better society, and move toward more racial equality. Whereas in Iran, the mosques were similarly the backbone of where people were brought together, where social connections were made. But of course, they were all made for effects that were so negative that the society is still reeling from them. So I don't think that these structures or these infrastructures in and of themselves can have a positive effect on the society. But I think if we focus on the values that they issue, on the values that they perpetuate, if they are the values that Martin Luther King was perpetuating, which lifted the hearts of not just African Americans, but everybody who was listening to them, that is a huge achievement. And yes, that's missing, because if we look at the movements of the last year or two, the protests against George Floyd killing and all that, they have the right impetus to demand justice. But what they don't have is that that nationwide sentiment that it created, that wanted us all to be better and saw us all in it together as a society.
Roya, finally, on this July 4th, let's find one thing in particular to celebrate about the achievements of American democracy, and one thing that you think American democracy and citizenship need to work on, so that we can both celebrate and still seek to improve American democracy. It's never going to be perfect, but it can always be improved.
Well, I can tell you, as a woman who once lived in a society where her appearance was not determined by herself, where I could not decide how I would appear in public, but I was told what to dress, how to dress, how to look the moment I left my own home. I see the ability that we have as human beings, women included, to freely be on the streets, dress as we wish, hold the hand of a lover or whomever, walk down the street without being harassed, as a gift. These personal freedoms that we take for granted are things that people such as me, who haven't had them, and in fact who have suffered at the hands of those who have taken it away from us greatly, matter to me greatly. And I celebrate them, even though others may think that they're not all that significant. But we are still living at a time where generations of women at the other side of the world are fighting for these basic rights. And the other thing that I think we really need to address, and we need to work on making better, is a quality of education that we have in our public schools needs to improve to the degree that the difference between those who have access to better education, whether it's through private schooling or whatever, and those who attend public schools won't be that vast, because it is that huge gap between the quality of education of one school system as opposed to the other, which eventually determines who goes to what school, and then it establishes the foundation of the aristocracy that you and I are both speaking ill of, right? We believe that in order to narrow the gap, the income gap and the class gap, we need to establish a foundation that brings these two groups closer to each other. And I think addressing the education system is at the heart of that.
Well, Roya Hakakian, the Alexis de Tocqueville of the early 21st century, I want to thank you for a wonderfully entertaining and erudite and stimulating introduction to America. I want to also wish you a wonderful July 4th. I hope you eat a hot dog for us from How to Fix Democracy, Roya, and we will talk again in the not too distant future about citizenship and democracy, both in and out of America. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.